The year's 1879. December descends upon London like a shroud woven from coal smoke and river mist. The Thames runs black beneath bridges whose stones glisten with a film of ice and industrial residue. Along the embankment, gas lamps flicker to life at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, their feeble glow swallowed almost immediately by a fog so thick it transforms the greatest city on earth into a labyrinth of shadows and uncertain shapes. What if I told you that the romantic image of Victorian winter, the Christmas cards with their rosy-cheeked carolers, the novels filled with blazing hearths and festive gatherings, the paintings of snow-dusted streets where well-dressed figures stroll beneath lampposts, bears almost no resemblance to the reality experienced by the vast majority of London's inhabitants? That the season we have learned to associate with Dickensian charm and nostalgic beauty was, for most who lived through it, a time of suffering so profound, so pervasive, that winter itself became a form of seasonal apocalypse. Tonight we descend into the actual winter of Victorian London. We walk streets where the cold was not picturesque but lethal, where fog was not atmospheric but poisonous, where the simple act of staying warm required resources that millions did not possess. This is not the London of Christmas cards and sentimental fiction. This is the London that froze, that choked, that killed with quiet efficiency every year when the temperature dropped and the coal smoke settled like a toxic blanket over the sprawling metropolis. The truth, as always, bears the marks of those who did not survive to romanticize it. This story is only the beginning. Subscribe to continue exploring the secrets the Victorians left behind. When we conjure Victorian London in winter, certain images rise unbidden from the collective cultural memory. We see A Christmas Carol's transformed Scrooge, distributing largesse on snow-bright streets. We envision fashionable ladies in fur-trimmed cloaks, ascending the steps of Covent Garden for the opera, their breath forming delicate clouds in the crisp air. We imagine cozy domestic scenes, families gathered around hearths where Yule logs burn with cheerful ferocity, children pressing their noses to frosted window panes, the whole household insulated from the elements, by walls of brick and mortar, by curtains of heavy velvet, by the simple fact of being indoors. This mythology of Victorian winter has been carefully cultivated across more than a century through literature, through art, through the selective preservation of certain experiences and the systematic erasure of others. It is a mythology created almost entirely by and for those who had the resources to make winter merely inconvenient rather than existential. The writers who immortalized Victorian London in winter, Dickens, Gissing, even the journalists who described the season for middle-class newspapers, wrote from positions of relative security. They had homes with multiple fireplaces. They had coal cellars stocked with fuel. They had wool coats and leather boots, and the leisure to contemplate winter as a season of moral reflection rather than physical survival. But behind this literary construct, behind the carefully composed Christmas cards and the sentimental paintings, existed another winter entirely. Consider the physical reality of London as the 1870s gave way to the 1880s. The city had exploded across the landscape with a speed and scale unprecedented in human history. In 1801, roughly 1 million people inhabited Greater London. By 1881, that number had swollen to nearly 5 million. This growth occurred not through careful urban planning, but through anarchic expansion. Neighborhoods built without adequate sanitation, housing constructed as cheaply as possible to maximize landlord profits, entire districts where buildings rose so close together that sunlight never reached the ground-level streets, even at midsummer. Winter transformed this already problematic urban environment into something approaching Dante's vision of frozen hell. The temperature, by modern standards, might not seem extreme. Victorian London's winters rarely saw sustained periods below freezing. The city's position on the Thames and its latitude meant that truly Arctic conditions were uncommon. But temperature alone tells only a fraction of the story. What made Victorian London's winter so brutal was not the thermometer reading, but the interaction between cold, damp, pollution, and poverty, on a scale that our centrally heated, well-insulated modern lives make almost impossible to comprehend. Few today remember that Victorian buildings, even those of the relatively prosperous middle classes, provided only minimal protection from the elements. The technology of insulation barely existed. Walls were single brick thick in cheaper housing, slightly thicker in better areas, but none incorporated the air gaps and insulating materials that modern construction takes for granted. Windows, even in wealthy homes, consisted of single panes of glass in wooden frames that warped with age and moisture, creating gaps through which the wind whistled, with a sound that one observer compared to the keening of bereaved spirits. Heat in such buildings was not ambient, but localized, radiating from individual fireplaces that warmed only the immediate vicinity, while the rest of the room remained frigid. A family might huddle near the hearth in relative comfort, while the corners of the same room harbored temperatures barely above those outside. Bedrooms in all but the wealthiest homes were unheated entirely. To sleep in a Victorian winter was to retreat beneath piles of blankets and quilts so heavy they created their own burden, to wake with one's breath visible in the air, to dress quickly in clothes stiffened by cold. But the story grows darker when we consider what winter meant for those without even these minimal protections. London's housing stock included hundreds of thousands of what were euphemistically termed common lodging houses, establishments where the poorest workers could rent a bed for fourpence a night, or simply a place on the floor for twopence. These buildings offered no heat whatsoever. Their windows were often broken and stuffed with rags. Their walls ran with condensation that froze when temperatures dropped sufficiently. The inhabitants, laborers, match girls, flower sellers, those who earned just enough each day to afford that night's shelter, slept fully clothed under whatever covering they possessed, which was often nothing more than their own coat. And then there were those who could not afford even fourpence. The truly destitute, numbered in tens of thousands, spent winter nights wherever they could find minimal shelter, in doorways, under bridges, in the arches, beneath railway viaducts, where the stone offered some protection from wind, if not from cold. The embankment, constructed in the 1860s, became a notorious gathering place for rough sleepers, who huddled on its benches, their only warmth coming from newspapers stuffed inside their clothing, or from the proximity of other freezing bodies. Yet this was only the beginning of winter's assault on Victorian London. The cold was accompanied by, indeed, was inseparable from, a fog so dense and so poisonous that it transformed the city into a toxic maze. This was not the clean white fog of countryside mornings, but something altogether more sinister, a mixture of water vapor, coal smoke, and industrial emissions that Londoners called pea soupers for their thick yellowish-brown appearance. When winter brought temperature inversions that trapped this miasma at ground level, visibility dropped to a few feet. People became lost on familiar streets. Traffic halted. The air itself became a choking presence that invaded lungs and left everyone coughing, eyes streaming, throats raw. The health consequences of breathing this atmosphere for months each year were catastrophic, though the Victorians themselves did not fully understand the connection between their environment and their mortality. Respiratory diseases, bronchitis, pneumonia, tuberculosis, reached epidemic proportions every winter. The death rate in London rose predictably as temperatures fell, not merely from cold, but from the toxic combination of cold and polluted air that weakened even robust constitutions and killed the vulnerable with reliable efficiency. In reality, the winter death toll in Victorian London was so routine, so expected, that it barely merited comment in the press, unless the numbers exceeded even the normally elevated seasonal mortality. Newspapers published weekly returns from the Registrar General showing death rates climbing as reliably as mercury falling in a thermometer. A typical winter might see mortality increase by 30 or 40% above summer levels. The very old and very young died in greatest numbers. But winter claimed victims across all age groups, all classes, though never equally. What happened next defies the romantic myth we have inherited. The wealthy responded to winter's dangers not by addressing the systemic issues that made the season so deadly, but by retreating into their own fortified spaces, creating microenvironments where winter could be held at bay through the expenditure of vast quantities of coal and the labor of servants, whose job it became to maintain the illusion that winter was merely picturesque rather than dangerous. A single wealthy household might burn several tons of coal per month during winter, feeding fireplaces in every major room, maintaining temperatures that would seem almost tropical in their contrast to the frozen world beyond the walls. The middle classes, aspiring to similar comfort but lacking equivalent resources, bankrupted themselves on coal bills or simply accepted that large portions of their homes would remain uninhabitable during winter months. They concentrated their lives in a few heated rooms, closing off entire floors, living in conditions that were merely uncomfortable rather than lethal, but which represented a significant degradation from their summer existence. The working poor made impossible calculations, spend scarce pennies on coal and go hungry, or buy food and freeze. There was rarely enough money for both. Families huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat in crowded rooms where disease spread with terrifying speed. Children went to bed hungry because the choice had been made to buy coal rather than bread, or went to bed cold because the opposite choice had been made. There were no good options, only variations of hardship, and for those with no resources at all, winter was simply a matter of survival until spring, if they survived at all. The visual contrast between these different experiences of winter was stark enough that it could not be entirely ignored. A wealthy man walking to his club might pass rough sleepers on the embankment, their forms barely distinguishable from the piles of rags they resembled. A middle-class woman shopping on Oxford Street might encounter flower girls whose bare hands had turned blue from cold, who sold their wares with voices hoarse from both cold and the early stages of respiratory disease. The evidence of winter's brutal inequality was everywhere, unavoidable. But the dominant culture had developed sophisticated mechanisms for not seeing what was directly in front of them, for transforming systemic crisis into individual moral failure, for maintaining the comfortable fiction that those who suffered in winter did so through some deficiency of character rather than economic necessity. Let us descend now beneath the surface narrative, past the shop windows displaying warm wool and the theaters promising heated interiors, and enter the actual mechanisms by which Victorian London attempted to make winter survivable. Let us follow the coal from the moment it arrived in the city until it became the heat and light and breathable poison that defined winter existence. Let us trace the water that froze in pipes and had to be carried in buckets. Let us walk the streets at dawn when the snow, if it fell, was still white before the day's coal smoke turned it gray. Winter in Victorian London began not with the first frost, but with the coal deliveries that intensified as autumn progressed. The city's appetite for coal was insatiable. By the 1880s, London consumed upward of 11 million tons annually, and perhaps a third of that total was burned during the 4 months of deepest winter. This coal, arrived by railway from the northern mining districts, was transferred to coal yards scattered throughout the city, and from there was distributed by coal merchants, whose carts clattered through the streets from dawn until dusk. The coal itself was a commodity so central to winter survival that its price and quality became matters of life and death. The poorest households could afford only the cheapest grades, small coal, sometimes called slack, which burned fast and produced minimal heat, but cost half the price of good household coal. Wealthier families ordered coal by the ton, storing it in purpose-built cellars where it remained dry and ready. The poor bought it by the hundredweight, sometimes by the bucket, spending money they could not afford because the alternative was literally freezing. But the story grows darker when we examine the labor that made this coal economy function. The coal heavers, men who unloaded coal from ships and railways, who carried it on their backs in hundredweight sacks, who delivered it to houses throughout the city, worked in conditions that turned their bodies into premature ruins. Coal dust coated their lungs, their skin, their clothing, turning them into walking silhouettes even in daytime. In winter, this work became even more brutal. The coal was often frozen in the railway cars and had to be broken apart with picks. The sacks, when wet from rain or snow, became exponentially heavier. The men's hands, perpetually blackened, developed deep cracks that never fully healed, that bled into the coal they carried, that became infected with an inevitability that made old age among coal heavers a rarity. A coal delivery to a wealthy home was a carefully choreographed operation. The coal cart stopped at the front of the house, and the coal heavers, usually working in pairs, carried sack after sack down narrow steps to the coal cellar, emptying them into the bin with a crash that echoed through the house. The householder or housekeeper inspected the delivery, checking for stones and other adulterants that unscrupulous merchants mixed with the coal to increase their profit. The transaction concluded with payment, usually on credit against monthly accounts for the wealthy, in immediate cash for those less established. Few today remember that the maintenance of heat in a Victorian building required constant labor-intensive attention. In a typical middle-class home, the day began at 5 or 6 in the morning when the housemaid descended to the basement kitchen to light the range, that enormous cast-iron structure that provided cooking heat and often heated water for the rest of the house. This was no simple task in winter. The range had to be cleaned of yesterday's ash, which in cold weather might have frozen solid overnight. New coal had to be laid carefully, kindling arranged, paper stuffed into strategic locations. The process could take 30 minutes or more, and if done incorrectly, the result was a kitchen filled with choking smoke and a range that refused to heat properly. While the range was being coaxed to life, other fireplaces throughout the house required similar attention. In a home of any size, there might be 6 or 8 fireplaces in the drawing room, dining room, library, study, and perhaps 1 or 2 bedrooms. Each needed to be cleaned of ash from the previous day, relayed with coal and kindling, and prepared for lighting when the family stirred. The ash removal alone generated clouds of fine dust that settled on every surface, requiring additional cleaning. The coal carried up from the cellar left a trail of black dust on stairs and carpets. The constant battle against coal's residue occupied a significant portion of every servant's day. Yet this was only the visible labor of heating. There existed an entire shadow economy of winter work that occurred largely unseen. Water management became a daily crisis in winter. Pipes, which in Victorian London were often external to buildings or ran through unheated spaces, froze with predictable regularity. When this happened, water had to be carried from communal pumps or standpipes, sometimes from considerable distances. In poor neighborhoods, the morning scene at water sources resembled something from a siege. Crowds of people with buckets and pails, waiting their turn, filling containers that they then carried home through streets made treacherous by ice. The water itself was often frozen around the edges of the pump, requiring hot water, obtained from where, to be poured over the mechanism before it would function. Even in homes with functioning indoor plumbing, the water that emerged from taps was so cold it was painful to use for washing. The elaborate Victorian morning toilette, which for the wealthy involved washing with warm water brought to their rooms by servants, depended on water being heated in vast quantities in the kitchen, then carried up multiple flights of stairs while still hot. A single warm bath for a family member might require 20 gallons of hot water, all of it heated on the kitchen range, then transferred to cans and hauled to the bathroom or bedroom. The servant who performed this task multiple times daily, up narrow back stairs, developed a particular gait, a way of holding the body that distributed the weight of the scalding water while avoiding burning oneself that was immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with domestic service. The streets themselves became different entities in winter. Without modern snow removal equipment or effective street cleaning, snowfall transformed the urban landscape into a treacherous obstacle course. The main thoroughfares might be cleared by hand, crews of men with shovels pushing snow into piles that then sat for weeks, turning gray and then black from coal smoke. Side streets in poor neighborhoods remained impassable, forcing residents to forge paths through snow that mixed with the contents of overflowing cesspits and the refuse that accumulated in streets where garbage collection was irregular at best. What happened next reveals the ingenuity born of desperation. A cottage industry of winter-specific labor emerged. Crossing sweepers, usually children or the elderly, stationed themselves at intersections, using brooms to clear paths through the slush and filth, accepting pennies from pedestrians grateful not to ruin their boots. These sweepers occupied a social position so marginal they barely registered in official statistics, yet they performed a function that the city's infrastructure entirely failed to provide. In winter, their numbers swelled as the desperate sought any means of earning a few coins. Vendors of hot food and drink proliferated in winter in response to a population desperate for warmth in any form. Coffee stalls appeared on street corners, selling cups of hot coffee or tea for a penny, providing both liquid warmth and a brief respite from the cold for costermongers, laborers, and others whose work kept them outdoors. Baked potato sellers, often women who carried their portable ovens through the streets, found eager customers willing to pay twopence for a potato, whose value lay as much in the warmth it provided to cold hands as in its nutritional content. In reality, an entire economy existed solely to mitigate winter's effects, an economy of coats pawned in summer and redeemed in November if money allowed, of blankets rented from pawnbrokers at exorbitant interest, of shoes resoled with cardboard when leather was unaffordable, of newspapers stuffed inside clothing for insulation, of alcohol consumed not for pleasure, but for the temporary sensation of warmth it provided even as it ultimately accelerated heat loss from the body. The workhouses, those Victorian institutions designed to make poverty so unpleasant that people would accept any alternative, swelled in population each winter. For the truly desperate, the workhouse offered heated rooms and regular meals in exchange for grueling labor and the surrender of all personal autonomy. The decision to enter the workhouse was never made lightly. Families were separated, conditions were deliberately harsh, the stigma was profound. But winter made choices stark. Some chose the workhouse, others chose to gamble on surviving the streets. But behind this visible struggle for warmth and survival operated deeper systems that shaped who lived and who died when winter descended. The geography of cold was also a geography of class. The wealthy lived in the West End, on higher ground where fog was marginally less thick, where houses were larger and better built. The poor concentrated in the East End, in low-lying areas near the river, where fog settled like a permanent miasma, where housing was oldest and most decrepit. This was not accidental. Victorian London had developed a precise spatial organization that reflected and reinforced economic hierarchies, and winter made these hierarchies literally visible in the distribution of warmth and cold, light and darkness, breathable air and toxic fog. The physical sensation of winter varied so dramatically by class that people living mere miles apart might have been experiencing entirely different seasons. In a wealthy home in Mayfair, winter meant multiple fireplaces burning constantly, heavy velvet curtains drawn against drafts, fur rugs on floors, servants maintaining a comfortable temperature throughout the public rooms. The inhabitants wore indoor winter clothing, wool dresses for women, smoking jackets for men, but they were never cold. They experienced winter as an atmospheric quality visible through windows, a season that made their interiors seem more cozy by contrast. A mile east, in Bethnal Green or Whitechapel, winter meant an entirely different reality. Families crowded into single rooms where a small coal fire, if they could afford coal, provided the only heat. Children wore all the clothing they owned simultaneously. The elderly and sick, too weak to generate much body heat, occupied positions nearest the fire if there was one. Windows broken and stuffed with rags. Walls running with condensation that froze in patterns resembling diseased foliage. The cold was not atmospheric but corporeal, a physical presence that invaded the body and never entirely departed until spring. Few today remember that this disparity was not hidden or controversial. It was simply accepted as the natural order. The wealthy did not deny that the poor suffered in winter. They simply did not consider this suffering to require systemic remedy. Charity increased in winter. Benevolent societies distributed coal and blankets. Missions served hot meals. Churches opened their doors for a few hours to offer shelter. But these efforts were understood as emergency measures, not as evidence that the fundamental organization of society might be unjust. The Victorian winter was maintained as a season of both physical extremity and moral testing, precisely because those who had the power to change conditions were insulated from experiencing those conditions themselves. They encountered winter poverty as spectacle, as object of potential charity, never as their own lived reality. And so, the machinery of winter ground forward year after year improved only incrementally, with suffering accepted as inevitable rather than as evidence of systemic failure. Winter in Victorian London was not merely a season of cold, but a mechanism of social control, a time when the structures of power and hierarchy that operated year-round became more visible, more brutal, more literally a matter of life and death. The unequal distribution of warmth, shelter, and breathable air was not an unfortunate accident, but a predictable consequence of economic and political arrangements that concentrated resources upward while pushing vulnerability downward. Consider the question that every poor household faced as temperatures dropped, whether to heat or to eat. This was not a rhetorical dilemma, but a weekly, sometimes daily calculation. A hundredweight of decent coal cost roughly 1 shilling. A laborer might earn 12 to 15 shillings per week if employment was steady, which in winter it often was not. Construction work halted, dock labor slowed, outdoor occupations became scarce. Meanwhile, rent had to be paid, food purchased, clothing maintained. The arithmetic was impossible, and yet somehow families had to solve it. The choices made under this pressure revealed the iron logic of poverty. Buy coal, and the family stays marginally warm but goes hungry, weakening everyone and making them more susceptible to disease. Buy food, and the family freezes, which also leads to illness. There was no correct answer, only least worst options, and the consequences of choosing poorly were measured in children's graves and adults aged prematurely into decrepitude. But the story grows darker when we examine the mechanisms by which the powerful exploited winter's vulnerability. Landlords, fully aware of their tenants' desperation, raised rents in winter or evicted those who fell behind, knowing that finding new tenants willing to accept appalling conditions was easier when the alternative was sleeping rough in freezing temperatures. The threat of eviction in winter carried particular terror. To be cast out in December or January was potentially a death sentence, and landlords wielded this power with casual brutality. The records of Victorian housing courts reveal a steady drumbeat of eviction cases throughout winter months. Families ejected for owing a few shillings in back rent, their possessions dumped in the street to be soaked by rain or buried in snow. Employers similarly exploited winter's pressure. Wages might be cut for indoor workers on the theory that they should be grateful to have any employment. Outdoor laborers found themselves competing for scarce work, driving down rates to starvation levels. The casual labor system, where men gathered at dock gates or hiring halls each morning, hoping to be selected for a day's work, became even more degrading in winter, with hundreds competing for positions that might employ dozens. The pawnbroking industry reached its annual peak in winter, as families cycled through an endless round of pawning possessions on Monday to survive the week, redeeming them on Saturday after payday, only to pawn them again the following Monday. Winter clothing, the coats and blankets most needed during cold months, carried the highest pawn value, and therefore were most likely to be traded for temporary cash. The pawnbroker's profit came from interest and from the certainty that some percentage of pawned items would never be redeemed, becoming the broker's property to resell. This system extracted wealth from those who could least afford it, yet it was often the only credit available to the poor. What happened next exposes the violence embedded in Victorian winter charity itself. The charitable organizations that proliferated in winter, the societies distributing coal tickets, the missions serving soup, the shelters offering temporary beds, operated on principles that often caused as much suffering as they relieved. Most required proof of deserving poverty before assistance was granted. Applicants had to demonstrate their moral worthiness, had to show they were not drunkards or profligates, had to accept religious instruction or moral lectures as the price of a bowl of soup or a bag of coal. The Charity Organization Society, founded in 1869, explicitly rejected the idea of helping the undeserving poor, arguing that indiscriminate charity encouraged dependency and moral degradation. They investigated applicants with thoroughness that the police might have envied, maintaining records of who had received help and from whom, attempting to prevent anyone from receiving aid from multiple sources. The message was clear. Even in the depths of winter, when cold was killing people, charity would be dispensed only to those who met middle-class standards of behavior and gratitude. In reality, winter charity functioned as much to reinforce social hierarchies as to alleviate suffering. The wealthy donors received moral satisfaction and social prestige. The poor recipients received minimal material assistance, along with maximum humiliation. The system was designed to make poverty shameful, to transform what was essentially an economic problem into a moral failing of the individual poor person. The workhouse system represented the ultimate expression of this philosophy. In winter, these institutions filled beyond capacity with people who had exhausted all alternatives. The conditions inside were deliberately harsh. The 1834 Poor Law had mandated that workhouse conditions be less desirable than the worst circumstances outside, to discourage all but the truly desperate from seeking admission. In winter, this meant that even as people froze on the streets, the workhouse remained a last resort rather than a refuge. Few today remember the physical reality of workhouse winter. The buildings were large, cold, institutional structures where heating was minimal and inadequate. Inmates wore thin uniforms regardless of temperature. Work was assigned without regard to the weather. Oakum picking, unraveling old rope, continued in unheated rooms where breath frosted in the air. Families were immediately separated upon admission. Husbands from wives, parents from children. The elderly and infirm, those most vulnerable to cold, received no special consideration. The regime was one of deliberate privation, designed to punish poverty, even as it nominally relieved it. Yet the workhouse represented only the most visible institution of winter control. More subtle mechanisms operated throughout the social fabric. Credit became a weapon in winter. Shopkeepers who extended credit during warmer months, allowing customers to put it on the slate until payday, often withdrew this privilege in winter when debts accumulated and the risk of default increased. This meant that precisely when families most needed the flexibility of buying food or fuel on credit, that option disappeared, forcing impossible choices or outright hunger. The medical profession, such as it was, became another site of class distinction in winter. Wealthy families called doctors to their homes at the first sign of winter illness. Poor families had access only to the overcrowded dispensaries and hospitals that served the working poor, where waits were long and treatment minimal. Many avoided medical attention entirely because even free dispensaries charged small fees, or because taking time off work to attend meant lost wages, or simply because they had learned through bitter experience that the medical establishment had little to offer for winter's characteristic diseases. The police, meanwhile, maintained a peculiar dual role in winter. They were charged with removing rough sleepers from the streets, rousing anyone found sleeping in doorways or under bridges, ostensibly for the person's own protection, but in practice, simply moving the problem from one location to another. Yet the same police often looked the other way when desperate people broke into empty buildings for shelter, or when small acts of theft, stealing coal, pilfering food, occurred out of obvious need rather than criminal intent. This discretion was applied inconsistently, according to the individual officer's temperament, creating a capricious system where survival might depend on which constable encountered you. But behind all these mechanisms of control lay something even more fundamental: the way Victorian winter naturalized inequality, made it seem inevitable. The dominant ideology of the era held that poverty resulted from individual moral failing, laziness, drunkenness, improvidence. Winter, in this view, simply revealed character. Those who suffered in winter did so because they had failed to prepare, had lived carelessly, had spent their summer earnings on frivolities rather than saving for the difficult season ahead. That systematic economic arrangements made such saving impossible for millions of workers earning subsistence wages was simply not acknowledged in polite discourse. This ideology served crucial functions for the wealthy and powerful. It absolved them of responsibility for suffering they could observe everywhere around them. It justified minimal charitable intervention and opposition to systematic social reform. It maintained the fiction that Victorian society was fundamentally just, that those at the top had earned their position through virtue, while those at the bottom had similarly earned their suffering through vice. Winter made this ideology difficult to maintain in its pure form. The sheer scale of suffering, the obvious arbitrariness of who had resources and who did not, the children dying who could not possibly have earned their fate through moral failure, all of this created cognitive dissonance that even the most ideologically committed struggled to resolve. The solution was a form of selective attention, of looking past the suffering or reframing it through religious or moral narratives that made it comprehensible within existing worldviews. The psychological toll of winter poverty extended beyond physical suffering into a realm of shame and degradation that the comfortable could barely imagine. To be unable to heat your home, to watch your children shiver, to calculate whether you could afford both food and fuel, this was not merely uncomfortable, but profoundly humiliating in a society that defined adult responsibility in terms of providing for one's family. Men, particularly, experienced winter poverty as emasculation, as visible proof of their failure to fulfill what Victorian culture defined as their primary masculine duty. Women faced different but equally crushing burdens. The domestic sphere was defined as their domain, in keeping the household functioning in winter, managing inadequate resources, stretching every penny, somehow keeping children fed and clothed on impossible budgets, fell to them. The constant calculations, the daily confrontation with insufficiency, the knowledge that no matter how hard they worked, the resources simply were not there. This created a grinding anxiety that never entirely lifted from October through March. What happened next reveals how winter became a test that most were designed to fail. Let us turn now to a particular winter, to specific people whose experiences were recorded and whose suffering was not merely abstract, but documented with enough detail that we can reconstruct not just what happened, but what it felt like. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was particularly brutal. Temperatures dropped lower than usual, snow fell heavily, and unemployment reached levels that created genuine crisis, even by Victorian standards of normalized poverty. In Bethnal Green in London's East End, a family named Morrison inhabited 2 rooms on the 3rd floor of a lodging house at Meadow Street. The building itself was typical of the area, built in the 1840s, originally intended for artisan families, but by the 1880s divided and subdivided into the smallest possible rental units to maximize the landlord's income. 5 families occupied the floor the Morrisons lived on, sharing a single privy in the yard 3 floors below, drawing water from a communal tap that froze solid whenever temperatures dropped below a certain threshold. Thomas Morrison was 32 years old, a dock laborer who worked when ships came in requiring cargo handlers, who spent his days waiting at dock gates when no work was available, who earned perhaps 10 shillings a week during good periods and nothing during slack times. His wife Mary was 28, her face already bearing the lines of someone much older, worn down by 8 years of marriage that had produced 6 children, 3 of whom had survived infancy. The surviving children were Thomas Jr., age 7, Elizabeth, age 5, and baby William, not yet 2. The Morrison family's rooms cost 4 shillings 6pence per week, nearly half Thomas's earnings during a good week, more than he earned during bad ones. The rooms themselves were approximately 12 feet square each, one serving as living space and kitchen, the other as bedroom for the entire family. A small iron fireplace in the main room provided the only heat for both spaces. The windows were single-paned, their frames so warped that gaps showed clearly, stuffed with rags that absorbed moisture and froze solid in deep winter. The walls were damp even in summer. In winter, they ran with condensation that formed ice patterns in the mornings. What happened to the Morrisons during the winter of 1886 to 1887 was documented by a visitor from the Charity Organization Society, a middle-class woman named Eleanor Rathbone, who was conducting investigations into East End poverty. Her notes, preserved in the Society's archives, provide a rare glimpse into the granular reality of winter survival. On the morning of January 15, 1887, Eleanor Rathbone climbed the dark stairwell of Meadow Street. The stairwell had no windows, and she noted in her diary that she had to feel her way up by touching the wall, which was unpleasantly damp and very cold. She knocked on the Morrisons' door at 10 o'clock in the morning. Mary Morrison answered, holding baby William on her hip. Mrs. Rathbone's first observation was that the woman wore no shoes. Her feet were wrapped in rags. The temperature outside was below freezing. The room Mrs. Rathbone entered was, in her words, dim and bitterly cold, despite a small fire burning in the grate. The fire consisted of a handful of coal and what appeared to be broken wood, possibly furniture parts. The 2 older children, Thomas Jr. and Elizabeth, sat on the floor near the fire, wearing multiple layers of clothing, their faces pinched and pale. Mrs. Rathbone noted that the children did not immediately look up at her entrance. They seemed remarkably listless for children of their age. Mary Morrison explained their situation in a voice that Mrs. Rathbone described as flat, without effect, as though describing someone else's circumstances. Thomas had not worked for 3 weeks. The docks had been slow, and even when ships came in, there were far more men seeking work than positions available. The family was 5 weeks behind on rent. The landlord had threatened eviction. They had pawned almost everything they could. Thomas's good coat, the extra blankets, Mary's wedding ring, even some of the children's clothing. What remained was what they wore, and what was too worn to have any pawn value. The coal in the grate was the last of a small bag Mary had bought 2 days earlier with money earned by taking in washing, work that was scarce in winter and that paid almost nothing. She had used some of the coal to heat water for the washing, the rest for keeping the room marginally habitable. The broken wood burning in the fire was indeed furniture. Thomas had begun dismantling an old chair the previous day, breaking it apart for fuel. Mrs. Rathbone asked about food. Mary showed her what they had: a heel of bread, perhaps 6 ounces, some tea leaves that had already been used once, a small amount of dripping. This was meant to feed 5 people until Thomas found work, or Mary could earn more washing. Money. Mrs. Rathbone recorded in her notes, "When I inquired what the children had eaten that morning, Mrs. Morrison stated they had shared a piece of bread with dripping. I observed the children showed no interest in our conversation about food, which I found more disturbing than if they had shown hunger. But the story grows darker when we examine what happened next." Mrs. Rathbone, following the protocols of the Charity Organization Society, began her investigation to determine whether the Morrisons qualified as deserving poor. She asked about Thomas's drinking habits. Was he a temperate man? Mary assured her he was, that he had never been a drinking man, that every penny went to rent and food. She asked about their church attendance. Did they attend regularly? Mary explained they had attended St. Matthew's until their shoes had become too worn to walk the distance in winter. She asked whether they had applied to other charities. Had they been receiving multiple forms of assistance, which would suggest they were working the system? Mary Morrison answered each question with a patience born of desperation, understanding that her family's survival might depend on satisfying this well-dressed woman's inquiries. Mrs. Rathbone noted every response in her ledger, cross-referencing with other charitable organizations' records, building a case file that would determine whether the Morrisons received help. The investigation took perhaps 30 minutes. During this time, Mrs. Rathbone observed details she recorded with what appears to be genuine distress beneath her professional demeanor. Baby William, she noted, had a persistent cough that sounded alarmingly wet. The child's breathing was labored, visible even through his clothing. When Mrs. Rathbone suggested a doctor should see him, Mary Morrison replied, "What good would that do? I cannot afford the medicine he would prescribe, and I know what the doctor would say. The child needs warmth and food, which I cannot provide." The two older children, Thomas Jr. and Elizabeth, remained largely motionless during the visit, conserving energy in a way that seemed instinctive. Mrs. Rathbone attempted to engage young Thomas in conversation, asking him about school. He replied in monosyllables that he had not attended in several weeks. His boots had fallen completely apart, and his mother could not send him barefoot in the snow. Elizabeth said nothing at all, simply staring at the small fire with an intensity that suggested she was trying to absorb its meager warmth through sight alone. Few today remember that this interview, this investigation, was itself a form of violence, forcing people in crisis to prove their worthiness, to perform deference and gratitude, to open their private suffering to the scrutiny of strangers who held power over whether they would receive help. Yet it was considered progressive, enlightened even, compared to the alternative of no organized charity at all. Mrs. Rathbone concluded her investigation by determining that the Morrisons were indeed deserving. She authorized the distribution of a coal ticket worth 100 weight of coal and 2 shillings in cash for immediate food relief. She also noted that she would inquire about possible employment for Thomas through a gentleman of her acquaintance who had interests in shipping. Before leaving, she gave Mary a religious tract about perseverance through trials, which Mary accepted with thanks. The coal ticket and 2 shillings represented perhaps 3 or 4 days of relief. After that, the Morrisons would be back where they started, and the rules of the Charity Organization Society prevented them from receiving assistance again for at least a month. The employment inquiry Mrs. Rathbone promised might lead to nothing. Such promises were easy to make and rarely resulted in actual jobs. What happened over the following weeks reveals winter's true brutality. Thomas Morrison did find occasional work, a day here and there, but nothing steady. The family cycled through periods of having a small fire and having none, of having bread and having nothing. Mary took in more washing when she could, though the work destroyed her hands, leaving them raw and bleeding from constant immersion in cold water and harsh soap. She developed a chronic cough that she ignored because there was nothing to be done about it. Baby William's cough worsened. By early February, his breathing had become a desperate wheeze, audible across the room. Mary knew what this meant. She had lost 2 other children to winter respiratory diseases. She held the baby constantly, trying to warm him with her own body heat, but she herself was malnourished and cold, with little warmth to share. On February 12, 1887, William Morrison died in his mother's arms. The cause listed on the death certificate, filed 3 days later, was bronchitis and malnutrition. He was 20 months old. The burial was arranged by the parish, a pauper's funeral at public expense, because the Morrisons had nothing left with which to bury their son. Mary Morrison did not attend. She had no shoes and no coat adequate for standing outside in February cold, while her baby was buried in a mass grave with other paupers who had died that week. This was not unusual. This was not exceptional. This was winter in Victorian London for hundreds of thousands of people. a grinding season of loss and survival, where the death of children was sad but expected, grieved but not surprising. Yet this was only one family's story. To understand winter's full impact, we must multiply this suffering across the city. In the winter of 1886 to 1887, the Registrar General recorded 7,245 deaths in London from bronchitis alone, a disease directly related to cold, damp conditions and air pollution. Add pneumonia, tuberculosis, and other respiratory diseases, and the winter death toll climbed into the tens of thousands. These were not anonymous statistics, but individual tragedies, each one leaving families devastated, communities depleted, futures erased. The poorest districts showed mortality rates 3 or 4 times higher than wealthy areas. In Bethnal Green and Whitechapel, in Bermondsey and Southwark, winter killed with democratic indifference to individual virtue or effort. The children who died had committed no moral failing. The adults who worked themselves to death trying to survive had shown remarkable fortitude, not laziness. The system that made such deaths routine was morally bankrupt, yet it continued because those with power to change it were insulated from its consequences. In reality, winter functioned as a form of population control, culling the weakest and most vulnerable, with an efficiency that no Victorian would have openly acknowledged, but which everyone understood. The workhouse infirmaries filled with elderly poor who would not survive until spring. The orphanages received waves of children whose parents had died or could no longer care for them. The casual wards, the absolute bottom tier of poor law provision, where the destitute could receive one night's shelter in exchange for work, saw hundreds turned away nightly because capacity was exceeded. The wealthy, meanwhile, continued their winter social season. The balls and theater performances, the dinners and at-homes, in warm rooms where winter existed only as atmospheric backdrop to their pleasures. The same week William Morrison died in his mother's arms in an unheated room, the Prince of Wales attended a ball at Marlborough House, where the conservatory was heated to tropical temperatures, and thousands of hothouse flowers bloomed impossibly in February. This was not hypocrisy in the usual sense. The wealthy genuinely did not connect their comfort with others' suffering. They existed in different worlds that happened to occupy the same city, and the mechanisms that kept these worlds separate were so effective that crossing between them seemed almost impossible. Eleanor Rathbone could visit the Morrisons, could document their suffering, could even feel genuine sympathy, and then return to her own warm home without any sense of contradiction or complicity. But the story does not end with William Morrison's death, because individual tragedies, however heartbreaking, cannot fully convey the systematic nature of winter's violence. The winter of 1886 to 1887 marked a turning point, not because it was worse than previous winters, though it was bad, but because something shifted in how Londoners understood and responded to the suffering around them. The machinery of winter had always operated with brutal efficiency, but in this particular winter, the usual mechanisms of social control and ideological justification began to crack. On February 8, 1887, 4 days before William Morrison's death, an event occurred that shattered the comfortable fiction that winter poverty was merely an unfortunate but manageable aspect of modern life. A demonstration organized by the Social Democratic Federation, calling attention to unemployment and winter suffering, gathered in Trafalgar Square. The crowd, estimated at 10,000 people, was largely composed of the unemployed poor, though it included middle-class radicals and socialist organizers. What happened next defies the romantic myth of Victorian order and stability. The demonstration began peacefully enough, with speakers addressing the crowd about unemployment, about winter mortality, about the need for systematic social reform. But as the afternoon progressed, as more and more desperate people joined the gathering, the mood shifted. The crowd began to move, flowing down Pall Mall toward the West End, that protected enclave of wealth and privilege. And as they moved, windows were broken, shops were looted. The well-dressed pedestrians who normally strolled these streets fled in terror before a human wave of the desperate and angry. For several hours, parts of London's West End were effectively under the control of a crowd that the newspapers would later term a mob, but which was more accurately described as people who had nothing left to lose, making their presence impossible to ignore. The police were overwhelmed. Property was destroyed. The geography of the city, usually so carefully maintained with the poor kept to their districts and the wealthy secure in theirs, temporarily collapsed. The riots, for that was what they became, were eventually suppressed. Police reinforcements restored order. Arrests were made. But the psychological impact could not be suppressed so easily. The wealthy had been forced to confront the reality that their comfort was maintained not through natural order, but through force, through mechanisms of control that could fail, through the willingness of the poor to accept their suffering rather than rebel against it. The press response was predictably panicked. The Times declared that the dangerous classes had shown their true nature. Other papers called for harsh measures against socialist agitators who had incited the respectable poor to violence. But beneath the surface rhetoric, a different conversation was beginning, one that asked whether a society that produced such desperation might itself be at fault. Yet this was only the beginning of winter's political consequences. In the days following the riots, as order was restored and the usual patterns reasserted themselves, something unexpected happened. Donations to winter relief funds increased dramatically. The wealthy, frightened by what they had witnessed, opened their purses with an urgency that simple charitable impulse had never produced. Coal tickets were distributed in unprecedented numbers. Soup kitchens expanded their operations. The Lord Mayor's Fund for the Unemployed received contributions that dwarfed previous years. This response was not pure altruism. It was fear. It was recognition that winter poverty posed not merely a moral problem, but a practical threat to social stability. If the poor were desperate enough to riot, to threaten the West End, to momentarily disrupt the careful order that protected privilege, then something had to be done to prevent future outbreaks. Charity, from this perspective, was not kindness but insurance, a relatively cheap price to pay for maintaining the broader system intact. But the story grows darker when we examine how quickly this moment of crisis passed without fundamental change. By March, as winter loosened its grip and employment opportunities increased, the sense of urgency dissipated. The extra charitable donations were spent. The soup kitchens closed for the season. The wealthy returned to their usual lives, their brief panic fading as the immediate threat receded. The poor, as always, adapted to slightly better conditions, while knowing that next winter would bring the same struggles, the same impossible choices, the same death toll. The Morrisons, grieving their lost son, survived until spring. Thomas found more regular work as shipping increased. Mary's cough persisted but did not kill her, though it would trouble her for the rest of her life. Young Thomas eventually returned to school. Elizabeth remained frail, marked by winter in ways that would affect her throughout her childhood. They stayed in the same 2 rooms on Meadow Street, still paying 4 shillings 6 a week to a landlord who had threatened to evict them during their deepest crisis. Few today remember that this pattern repeated every winter through the 1880s and into the 1890s. Crisis, temporary response, return to normal, with the normal being a state of affairs that killed thousands annually. The Victorian winter system was not broken in the sense of failing to function. It functioned exactly as designed, extracting labor and profit while externalizing the costs onto those least able to bear them. The political movements that emerged from winter suffering, socialism, trade unionism, eventually the Labor Party, would take decades to achieve significant reforms. The immediate impact of the 1887 winter was minimal. Some small improvements were made in workhouse conditions. A few more public shelters were opened. but the fundamental structures that made winter so deadly remained untouched. In reality, Victorian society proved remarkably adept at absorbing challenges to its legitimacy without changing its essential character. The riots of 1887 were reframed as isolated outbreaks caused by radical agitators rather than as logical responses to intolerable conditions. The deaths of children like William Morrison continued to be treated as individual tragedies rather than systemic failures. The wealthy continued to believe that their position was earned and just, that poverty was primarily a moral condition, that winter simply revealed character rather than exposing economic injustice. What happened over the following decades reveals both slow progress and stubborn resistance. The 1890s saw the beginning of serious municipal efforts to address winter housing conditions. The London County Council, established in 1889, had more power than previous administrative bodies to regulate housing quality and enforce basic standards. But progress was achingly slow. Landlords resisted regulations that would cut into profits, legal challenges delayed implementation, and the sheer scale of the problem dwarfed available resources. The establishment of the first council housing in the early 20th century represented genuine progress, offering working families accommodations that were warmer, drier, and more sanitary than the slum lodgings that had previously been their only option. But these developments reached only a small fraction of those who needed them, and their rents, though below market rates, remained beyond the reach of the poorest workers. The Morrisons would never live in council housing. They would spend the rest of their lives in private rental accommodations that were marginally better than Meadow Street, but still characterized by inadequate heat, poor construction, and exploitative landlords. Thomas Morrison would work at the docks until his body gave out in his 50s. Mary would outlive him by a decade, supporting herself through casual labor and eventually a tiny old-age pension when those were finally established in 1908. Young Thomas, who had survived the winter of 1886 to 1887, would himself work at the docks as an adult, would experience his own winters of unemployment and hunger, would see his own children struggle through cold seasons. The cycle continued, modified slightly by reforms, but never truly broken, until the physical destruction of the Second World War and the welfare state that emerged afterward finally ended the Victorian winter system. But before we move too quickly to celebrate eventual progress, we must confront what Victorian winter reveals about how societies tolerate suffering. Now we arrive at the truths that were carefully omitted from Victorian self-mythologizing, the realities that do not appear in the era's extensive literary and artistic representations of winter, the knowledge that existed but was systematically excluded from respectable discourse. Victorian winter killed people. Not occasionally, not just in extreme cases, but routinely, predictably, in numbers that were tracked and recorded but never seriously addressed. The Registrar General's weekly returns showed mortality spikes every winter, with the regularity of clockwork. Medical officers of health in London's poorest districts filed reports documenting the direct relationship between cold, damp housing, and death rates. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and largely ignored by those with power to change conditions. This was not because the evidence was hidden. It was published, available to anyone who cared to examine it. The problem was that acknowledging what the evidence meant would have required admitting that Victorian society was structured in ways that condemned thousands of children, workers, and elderly people to death every year, not through natural necessity, but through social choice. This admission would have been intolerable to a culture deeply invested in its own moral superiority and civilizational advancement. They did not write honestly about the air they breathed. The coal smoke that made Victorian winter so deadly was not a tragic side effect of progress, but a predictable consequence of industrialization without regulation, of prioritizing profit over human health, of accepting working-class suffering as the price of middle-class comfort. Every fireplace burning in Mayfair contributed to the toxic fog killing people in Bethnal Green. Every factory chimney pumping smoke into the atmosphere poisoned air that everyone eventually breathed, though the poor breathed the worst of it. Medical knowledge of the era understood, at least partially, that coal smoke damaged lungs and exacerbated respiratory diseases. Doctors regularly advised wealthy patients with lung conditions to leave London in winter, to seek cleaner air in the countryside or abroad. But this solution was available only to those who could afford it. For everyone else, the advice was meaningless, and the medical profession largely shrugged off the suffering of those who could not escape the poisoned air. They did not write about the calculations that property owners made about winter deaths. Landlords knew their buildings killed tenants, the thin walls, the broken windows, the lack of any heating provisions. They had the evidence right in front of them every winter when tenants died or left sick. But improving conditions would have cost money and reduced profits. As long as there were more desperate people willing to rent any shelter, no matter how inadequate, there was no economic incentive to improve conditions. The system rewarded those who provided the cheapest possible housing. And cheapest possible meant barely habitable, frequently lethal. What happened next reveals the moral bankruptcy at the heart of Victorian prosperity. The wealth that built the British Empire, that constructed the grand buildings we admire today, that financed the cultural flowering we celebrate as Victorian achievement. This wealth was extracted in part through accepting winter mortality as simply the cost of doing business. Every employer who paid subsistence wages knew those wages were insufficient to properly heat and feed a family in winter. They knew it, and they paid those wages anyway, because the alternative would have reduced profits. The system was designed with perfect clarity. Extract maximum labor value while paying minimum wages, and externalize the costs. If workers died of winter diseases, there were always more desperate people needing work. If children suffered from cold and malnutrition, this was framed as parental failure, rather than as the inevitable consequence of paying family breadwinners less than subsistence wages. The elite were not ignorant of these dynamics. They simply found them acceptable. They did not write about the children. Victorian culture was obsessed with childhood innocence, produced extensive literature celebrating the special nature of children, constructed elaborate ideologies about childhood as a protected state requiring adult guardianship. But this sentimentality coexisted with practical acceptance of mass child suffering and death. The records show thousands of children dying every winter from preventable causes: cold, hunger, disease spread through overcrowding. These deaths were documented, counted, analyzed, and then filed away as regrettable but inevitable. The contradiction was resolved through class distinction. Middle-class and wealthy children were indeed protected, coddled, celebrated as precious innocents. Working-class children were viewed differently, as small economic units, as future workers, as somehow less fully human in their capacity for suffering. When they died in winter, this was sad but not shocking. They were understood as belonging to a different category of childhood, one that did not merit the protections that middle-class ideology insisted were universal childhood rights. Few today remember that the workhouse system, which separated families and treated poverty as crime, continued to expand throughout the Victorian period despite overwhelming evidence of its cruelty and failure. By 1890, there were over 600 workhouses in England and Wales, housing roughly 80,000 people at any given time. In winter, those numbers swelled significantly. The system persisted not because it worked, by any measure of human welfare, it was catastrophic, but because it served important ideological functions. The workhouse made poverty painful and shameful, deterring all but the absolutely desperate from seeking assistance. This kept relief costs low and reinforced the narrative that poverty was individual failure. The deliberate harshness, the separation of families, the inadequate food, the punitive labor, the institutional brutality was not an unfortunate side effect, but the system's purpose: make poverty so unpleasant that people would accept any alternative, any wage, any working condition, rather than enter the workhouse. In reality, the entire Victorian social system depended on maintaining a pool of desperate workers willing to accept exploitation because the alternative was starvation or the workhouse. Winter, by making survival more expensive and precarious, served this system perfectly. It kept workers compliant, kept wages low, kept the poor from organizing or demanding better conditions because they were too focused on immediate survival to engage in political action. The records reveal something else that Victorian public discourse never acknowledged. The wealthy knew exactly what they were doing. Private correspondence, diaries, business records. These documents show clear-eyed understanding of how the system functioned and conscious choices to maintain it. Factory owners discussed wage levels with full knowledge that paying more would allow workers to survive winter more comfortably, and explicitly chose not to pay more because competition wouldn't force them to. Landlords calculated exactly how little they could spend on building maintenance while still keeping properties rentable. Politicians privately admitted that workhouse conditions were inhumane while publicly defending them as necessary deterrents. This was not ignorance, but decision, not accident, but policy, not unfortunate side effect, but intended consequence. They did not write about their own complicity in winter mortality. The Victorian elite consumed vast quantities of coal to heat their oversized homes, contributing disproportionately to the air pollution that made winter air toxic. They invested in property that generated rental income, precisely because standards were not enforced. They purchased goods produced in factories where workers earned starvation wages. They voted for politicians who opposed social reforms that might have alleviated suffering but would have required higher taxes. Every comfort the wealthy enjoyed was made possible by systems that killed poor people routinely and predictably. This connection was not hidden. It was simply never discussed in polite company. To acknowledge it would have required admitting that their lifestyle was not morally neutral, but actively harmful, that they were not innocent beneficiaries of natural economic order, but active participants in structured violence. But the story grows even darker when we examine how Victorian winter shaped the 20th century. The patterns established in Victorian winter, accepting routine mortality among the poor, externalizing environmental costs, treating suffering as individual failing rather than systemic problem, did not end when the Victorian era formally concluded in 1901. These patterns persisted, evolved, found new forms. The specific mechanisms changed. Coal smoke eventually declined as heating sources diversified. Housing standards gradually improved. Welfare systems emerged. But the underlying logic of accepting preventable suffering to maintain economic arrangements beneficial to the powerful continued. The environmental destruction that Victorian coal burning represented was merely the beginning of a longer story of prioritizing immediate profit over long-term consequences, of imposing costs on those least able to bear them, of trusting that somehow the damage could be indefinitely deferred or externalized. The smoke that blackened Victorian London was an early chapter in the larger history of climate change, of treating the atmosphere as an infinite sink for industrial waste, of valuing growth over sustainability. The acceptance of mass homelessness that Victorian winter normalized, the rough sleepers, the inadequate shelter, the view that some percentage of the population simply would not be housed, this too persisted into our own era. The mechanisms and language changed, but the underlying acceptance of homelessness as inevitable rather than as policy failure continued. What they didn't want you to know was that Victorian winter was not an unavoidable natural hardship, but a manufactured crisis, that the suffering it caused was preventable with existing resources and technology, that it continued year after year, not because solutions were impossible, but because those with power to implement solutions chose not to do so. This choice was not made once, but repeatedly every day through thousands of individual decisions that collectively maintained a system that worked extremely well for a small minority while functioning as a death machine for hundreds of thousands of others. And so we return to where we began, to that November evening in 1887, to the gaslight flickering in Belgrave Square, to the windows glowing with warm light while the fog presses close against the railings. We return with different eyes now, seeing not elegance but machinery, not refinement but oppression, not civilization but an elaborate performance designed to conceal uncomfortable truths. What becomes of a society built on such foundations? What happens when the invisible labor that sustains privilege finally refuses to remain invisible? The Victorian elite believed they had created something eternal, a social order so natural and proper it would last forever. They invested enormous energy in preserving this illusion, in teaching their children to perpetuate it, in creating cultural narratives that justified and celebrated their way of life. But they built their palace on sand, on the assumption that other human beings would perpetually accept subordination, that no alternative would ever seem preferable to security, that the machinery of control would never break down. They were wrong. Within a generation, their world was gone, not destroyed in revolution, but simply dissolved, rendered obsolete by social and economic changes they had helped set in motion but could not control. The great houses were closed or converted to other purposes. The elaborate rituals of dress and dining simplified or disappeared entirely. The vast servant populations that had made their lifestyle possible dwindled to a handful, and eventually to none at all. Today, when we visit the preserved country houses that now operate as museums, when we take tours of Victorian London residences maintained by heritage organizations, we see only the surface, the beautiful objects, the elegant rooms, the careful restoration of architectural details. The tour guides speak of the family's history, their artistic patronage, their role in political life. They may mention briefly that, of course, there were servants, and perhaps show us the kitchen or the servants' hall. But they cannot truly convey what it felt like to be Hannah Pritchard, rising in darkness, working until exhaustion, existing in a state of perpetual surveillance and vulnerability. They cannot make us understand the psychological weight of knowing that your entire life depended on pleasing people who barely saw you as human. They cannot recreate the atmosphere of those houses, not just the visible parts, but the hidden machinery, the constant movement and labor that happened just out of sight, the human cost of all that gleaming silver and polished wood. The Victorian elite wanted to be remembered for their culture, their refinement, their contributions to civilization. They wanted portraits and monuments and history books that celebrated their achievements, while forgetting the foundations on which those achievements rested. And to a considerable extent, they succeeded. The dominant narrative of the Victorian era remains largely one they would recognize and approve, a story of progress and prosperity, of imperial might and cultural flowering. But history is not finished with them yet. As we gain distance from that era, as social historians examine documents the elite never intended for public consumption, as we learn to read their silences as eloquently as their pronouncements, a different picture emerges. We see not triumph, but tragedy, the tragedy of a privileged class so enclosed in their own worldview they literally could not imagine alternatives. So invested in their own superiority, they destroyed the capacity for genuine human connection. So afraid of their servants' humanity, they rendered them invisible. And we see ourselves, because the mechanisms they employed, the selective blindness, the self-serving narratives, the elaborate justifications for inequality, these have not disappeared. They simply wear different forms. We live in an age of global supply chains that allow us to enjoy cheap goods without seeing the workers who produce them, of service economies where people labor invisibly to maintain our comfort, of systems that concentrate wealth and power while claiming to reward merit and hard work. The Victorian elite's story is not just history, it is a warning. It shows us how easily privilege becomes invisible to those who enjoy it, how naturally exploitation gets reframed as opportunity, how smoothly violence can be dressed in the language of tradition and necessity. It demonstrates that being a good person by the standards of one's own society provides no protection against participating in profound injustice. Most of all, it reveals that systems of oppression do not require malicious individuals to function. They require only ordinary people who benefit from those systems and who therefore cannot afford to see them clearly. The fog in Belgrave Square has lifted now, both literally and metaphorically. The gas lamps have given way to electric light, the great houses to apartment buildings, the rigid hierarchies to more fluid social arrangements. But before we congratulate ourselves on our progress, before we judge the Victorian elite too harshly for their blindness, we might ask, what are we refusing to see? What systems sustain our comfort at others' expense? What will future generations say about us when they examine our lives with the same careful scrutiny we have applied to the Victorians? The answer should disturb our comfortable certainties, should make us question arrangements we take for granted, should remind us that privilege always comes at a cost, and that cost is always paid by someone. In the end, the untold life of the Victorian elite is not really about them at all. It is about us, about how we see, what we value, whether we have the courage to look honestly at the systems we inhabit and the role we play in maintaining them. It is about whether we will be remembered as they are being remembered now, not for our achievements and our elegance, but for what we failed to see and what we refused to change. The windows still glow in the darkness, but now we know what they conceal, and we cannot look away.